It's time for us to check back in with Louisa and see how she's making it in the book, Mountain Path. If you've missed any of my previous readings, you can look in the description below for a playlist from the book, Mountain Path. When we last left Louisa, she was spending her first night in her trustee, Lee Buck Cow's house. She had just went to bed, so now we'll take back up there. She was back in Lexington, lying on the lawn behind her aunt's house. There were rocks in the grass, and she had chosen to sleep on 2 of them. Somewhere her cousin screamed, "Teacher!" at her in a tone of derision, and she sat up. Daylight had come, and Corey stood at the foot of the stairs calling to her. She pushed hair out of her eyes and tried to remember everything at once. She was a school teacher, now boarding at Lee Buck Cow's, and today was the first day of school. She shivered, for the early morning air was cold. Did they always get up so early? She glanced at her watch, but it had stopped at 1:45. She pulled on a bathrobe and went to the window, hoping to see a sunrise. The sun was nowhere visible. Only an ocean of white fog with the roof of the barn and the tops of the apple trees rising like fantastic islands. She craned her head from the window and could see the top of a hill behind the garden where the pines shone red gold in a rising sun. After that first morning, she never looked again for the sunrise. At no time did the sunlight fall into the yard before she went to school, and it never stayed later than 3 or 4 o'clock, so that to her the cow home became a place of perpetual twilight. After some little thought, she selected a pink checked cotton house dress as the most appropriate thing to wear for her first day of teaching. She remembered the other trustee's words, "Don't be highfalutin." Here, even the plainest of silk sports dresses somehow seemed highfalutin. Downstairs, the whole family was astir, even to Beetle riding placidly on Rye. Breakfast was much like supper. She ate biscuits and bulldog gravy in silence with the men, while Corey stood by the stove or near the table, and Rye waved the fly switch. Lee Buck seemed in no mood for conversation, and Louisa, for the first time, studied him with the eye of a teacher appraising her trustee. His eyes were pleasant, holding nothing of the stark coldness of Chris's eyes, but rather, she thought, betokening a great good humor to take the world and its men as he found them. However, his eyes might be one thing, but under the week's blossoming of beard, his chin and the set of his lower jaw was another. Between sips of coffee, she studied his lower features and concluded that henceforth in all her relations with him, it might be a very good thing to take that part of his face first into consideration. She forgot Lee Buck's chin then when she saw Chris take notice of her pink dress. He was continually fastening his eyes on its white organdy collar. She wondered with more concern than she cared to admit if he liked the dress and thought she looked well in it. After breakfast, remembering her stopped watch, she inquired the time. Corey appeared somewhat confused. "Why, we ain't got no running timepiece, teacher. The last clock we had didn't act right, and Lee Buck took its insides out and couldn't get 'em all back in again. I don't know as it matters," she went on after an interval. "There ain't nobody nowheres round that has a timepiece going. Chris has got a watch, but he never keeps it wound. The Sally Hayes cows have got a clock, but the last time she let it run, it was dark at 2 in the evening." "Don't let the time worry ye," Rye consoled after Corey had gone to milk, leaving her and Louisa alone in the kitchen. "Atter milking time, and when we get the floors swept and the dishes washed and us young'uns get ready, it'll be school time," she explained. "I see," Louisa told her, a little startled by this vision of human clocks. "We'll always get to school on time." "Yes," Rye answered, as she washed the red lard bucket that was to hold teacher's lunch. "That's one good thing about having the teacher to board. We young'uns can't ever be late to school." She glanced through the kitchen door, raised her voice in a loud wail of "Pete!" and ran to the back porch and into the yard. Louisa followed her in time to see Pete, who had straddled the red-handled broom, holding it with one hand while he jiggled the empty water bucket and dipper in the other. He went prancing round and round under the apple trees. "You'll plumb knock the school supply to pieces," Rye cried, bringing the fancied mule to a standstill by a dexterous lift and pull on its hind parts. Pete took the broom from between his legs without loosening his grip on the handle and turned to his sister defiantly. "I'm a-goin' to carry the broom and the bucket to school," he told her. "But last night ye said if'n I'd let you take the broom, I could tote the bucket. But now I want to pack the bucket too. You take the racers and teacher's dinner." Rye considered. "All right, bein' as it's your first day, but I get the dipper." "Take everything just so I get the broom and bucket. Can we start now?" "Lord a mercy, no. What teacher think? Set the broom down and run around to Pomp's and tell 'em the teacher has come." "Can I take the broom with me?" "Land, no." "You won't go off to school and leave me and take it?" "No." "Honest?" "Cross my heart." He ran away then under the apple trees, through the yard gate, and up the rocky road. "Who is Pomp?" Louisa asked when Rye had returned to the porch. "He's got a boy in the school age, and he keeps the post office and sells things like coal and tobacco. If'n you want yarn goods or lard, you have to go clean over Cumberland, about 3 miles. "Is this place close to the river?" she asked in some surprise. "Yes'm. Our land touches Cumberland. I must—" Beetle's belligerent cry came from the direction of the front porch. "Oh, land o'-livin', these young'uns! I bet she crawled clean out of the big house and fell off the porch," and Rye went running away through the big house with Teacher behind her. Beetle lay at the foot of the steps, crying lustily. Rye picked her up, looked at her head, pulled her arms and legs, and then declaring that she had only rolled over the steps and was undamaged, carried her into the house, set her on the kitchen floor, and gave her all the spoons and a lard can to play with. Corey returned from the milking not long after. "Run get some kindling wood, Rye," she said. "I found a egg to fry for Teacher's dinner." By the time the egg was fried, the lunch packed, and Rye got into a clean dress, Pete had returned and it was school time. Corey stood on the back porch with Beetle in her arms and watched them off. "Ye young'uns be good," she said, "and Teacher, you make 'em mind, and Pete, you look out for that broom and bucket. Rye, Beetle's a-waving at you, and Teacher, she'll be missing you now." Teacher and the children waved until the broad blades of the high corn along the path hid the house and the woman by the door. The way led up the narrow valley, through a cornfield, turned and climbed the field, leaped a rail fence, and became a wagon track indolently skirting the edge of a heavily wooded hillside. The wagon track dipped a bit, and Louisa found herself looking at the kind of house sometimes encountered in fairy stories but almost never seen. It was a diminutive log church house, completely surrounded by high-growing poplar trees. Before the door was a cleared grassy space, smooth and wonderfully green, unbroken by any path or sign of use. The roof shingles were green with moss, and in one lower corner a clump of bluets grew, giving the whole roof a curiously rakish air for a thing so old. "I suppose you go to church here," she said to Rye. "No'm, nobody goes there," she answered. She was still a moment, looking at the house, and Louisa, watching her, thought something old and hard, like hatred, settled on her face for a split second of time. "I can't wait to show you the schoolhouse," she said, and the next moment, and Louisa, anxious to see the place herself, thought no more of the glimpse she had had of an emotion that she did not understand. The wheel track left the little cove of tall poplars and twisted up the hill a bit, where it took on the dignity of a big road filled with large, uneven pieces of blue-white limestone. "There it is, Teacher," Rye said when they were halfway up the hill. Louisa looked and saw a small weather-beaten frame building, painted white, and sitting on long posts in a nest of pines a little distance above the road. "It's the only house in the valley that ain't logs," Rye said. "And it's got a big heating stove," Pete said, pride in the schoolhouse mastering timidity for the moment. "And we've got a coal house," Rye told her, indicating a small roofless shack by the road. "Do you have toilets or a well?" Louisa asked, knowing before she finished the last word that the question was a senseless one. "We never needed such things," Rye said, going up the 3 rickety, mud-covered steps that led to the one door. The door was unlocked, so Louisa and her 2 pupils went in. There was a stove, an overly large, tall, heavy, fat-bellied monster in the middle of the room, a dozen or so of seats of all shapes and sizes scattered about the room in every conceivable position, and that was all. Louisa quelled a shiver of repulsion. The early morning cold was not yet gone from the place, and a thin sheeting of yellow dust lay over the floor and benches, so that to her the little room seemed fantastically ugly and dreary and dirty. It seemed impossible that she must come here day after day for 7 months and try to teach children without books or maps or pictures, without anything, in fact, except a strip of painted wall which she supposed was the blackboard. "And look, teacher," Rye said, her arms yet burdened with the things she had carried for Louisa, "we've got recitation benches and everything." She glanced at the 2 long, narrow, backless, homemade benches the child pointed to, and wondered what the purpose of such a bench might be, but was afraid to ask. Rye placed the few books, the chalk and erasers, and the empty record book on one of the benches, then stepped back and surveyed the meager pile with satisfaction. "We ought to have a good school, for you've brung plenty to work with," she said. "Last term, that Arthur Sears, he was too lazy to bring a broom, and we never swept for a month. He didn't bring no racers either, but this year we've got everything." "So we have," Louisa said, and for some reason felt a hot shame and a disgust for women who pitied themselves into forgetting that water buckets and dippers and children and chalk were the only essential school supplies. "I want to be the first to sweep with the new school broom," Rye said, seizing the broom from Pete and running to the front of the room where veils of dust were soon clouding the air. "Now, Pete," she began, noticing between sweeps that he stood motionless by the stove as if uncertain of just how to begin this his first day of school. "You just make yourself at home and get some props for the winders and open the chalk and help teacher get the recitation bench up front and put the seats where they ought to be. We want to get settled for Lander and Mabel and maybe Quiet gets here." "Who are they?" Louisa asked. "They're the Sally Hayes Cow young'uns, Pop's cousins. Chris told 'em we had a teacher when he went over there yesterday evening." "That was nice of Chris." "Yes'm, Chris is nice, even he did get into trouble. Mom said this morning she thought ye maybe must know something about it anyhow." She flushed and looked quickly away. Her eye happened upon the desk that Louisa was then tugging at. "I'd put that biggest desk in the front for the teacher's desk. It's the one the teachers most generally take. It ain't cut up so much as the others." "Lander and Mabel and Quiet are a-comin' up the road," Pete called as he came up the steps with some pieces of wood he had found for window props. "And us with the place hardly straight," Rye exclaimed, and fell to sweeping with great vigor. It seemed to Louisa, anxious as she was to see the other half of her school, that the Hayes Cow children were inordinately slow about coming up the road. She and Pete had arranged all the seats, and Rye had finished sweeping through the dust, though the dust was not yet settled, before 3 children slowly mounted the steps and stopped at the door. "Are we late?" a tall girl of about Rye's age asked timidly. "Just a-getting ready to take up books," Rye told her. The girl glanced first at Louisa and then at the new water bucket standing empty on the back bench. "Taking up books with an empty water bucket? We've been so busy we clean forgot the water, but Rye got no farther. The black-haired, black-eyed boy standing between his sisters made a sudden, soundless dive for the bucket. "Me and Pete'll go to the spring," he mumbled, leaping out the door again. "Y'all had better hurry," the tall girl called after them. "It'll be book time soon as you get back." Rye turned to Louisa. "The biggest girl," she explained, "is Mabel. Me and her take the same studies, except in arithmetic, and she takes it with Lander. He's between her and Quiet ain't never been to school before." "Mom said she's liable to cry," Mabel said, pulling Quiet from behind her so that the teacher might take a look at her. "If'n she does, just turn her and Pete loose outside for a spell," Rye suggested. "That's the best thing for crying, ain't it, teacher?" "Yes," Louisa said, in what she hoped was an authoritative voice, and more terrified of this sober-faced, big-eyed child who might cry than of anything else she had so far encountered in Cow Valley. "I think it would be a very good thing." Pete and Lander returned almost immediately, for the spring was on Lee Buck's land just a little below the church house. "It's school time now," Rye said, as soon as Lander had placed the bucket of water on the back bench. "So it is," Louisa said, and set her watch at 8 o'clock. 10 young eyes, 4 blue and 6 black, fixed themselves upon her in expectant waiting. It was then that panic took her for its own. What was it a teacher did first? She asked herself the question numerous times, but could find no adequate answer. She had no roll to call, and if she did have, there would be only 5 names on it. Sing a song? There were hardly enough to sing, and she thought it doubtful if they knew a song. Read a story? By that time, however, she doubted her ability to find it a proper story without a great deal of page-turning. Rye raised her hand, as she had been taught to do before speaking in school. "Did you forget the Bible, teacher? If'n you did, it'll be all right just to quote us some scripture. Some of the other teachers done that once in a while." She had forgotten a Bible. She had also forgotten the law of her state making it compulsory for a public school teacher to read without comment a portion of the scripture each day. The children sat waiting for her words of scripture. She could think of nothing. Yesterday she might have stumbled through the Lord's Prayer, or the 23rd Psalms, or possibly the first verses of the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Now it was all gone from her, but she must remember something. She could not forever go down in the annals of Cave Creek School as the teacher who knew no scripture. Words came to her, and in her desperation she spoke them. It little profits that an idle king, by this still hearth, among these barren crags, I meet, and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not anything, myself not least but honored of them all. When she had finished, she mumbled something about a chapter in Leviticus, the children tranquilly accepting the word of Tennyson as the word of God. Rye even nodded her head a bit with approval at the length of the quotation. Emboldened by the success of her Bible reading, she decided to try a song after all. "Let's all stand up and sing 'My Country 'Tis of Thee,'" she told them. The children arose, continuing meanwhile to stare at her with expressionless faces. "I suppose you know it?" she said to the room in general. After a short silence, Rye raised her hand. "Know 'em? We don't know it. Some of us know what it's about, though." "We'll learn it then," Louisa decided. She had them sit back down, and while she wrote the first stanza on the blackboard for the 3 who might be able to read it, and said the words over and over for Pete and Quiet. When the children stood up a second time, they sang surprisingly well, she thought. Next, chiefly to give her exercises a proper touch of formality, she asked the children to write their names and ages on a slip of paper. Rye raised her hand. "What do we do about Pete and Quiet?" "You write for Pete, and Mabel can write for Quiet," Louisa told her. Leander raised his hand. "Teacher, I can't ever spell January." She wrote the word on the blackboard and asked Rye to collect the slips. Lander's piece of paper was on top. She looked at it. After a moment, she deciphered the name Philander Calhoun. "Is that right?" she asked Rye, who had not sat down and was looking over her elbow. "Yes'm, that's right. We are all Calhouns," Rye explained, "when you spell it, but everybody calls us cows, just like everybody calls Philander Lander. It's easier, don't you think?" "Yes, it is," Louisa agreed, trying to imagine what might be the written name of the man Pomp. She had a state course of study, and feeling worse than foolish while the children watched her turn pages searching the program for a one-room school, she at length found such a schedule and studied it for a moment. First-year reading, she saw, was the first thing on the highly incomprehensible program. She picked up the primer she had brought with her, arose, and said, "First-year reading," trying as she did so to smile at Quiet, who looked terrifyingly serious. No one moved. After what seemed a long interval, Mabel raised her hand. "You mean the primer class, don't you, teacher?" Louisa nodded. "She means ye, Pete," Rye said in a loud whisper, giving Pete, who sat in front of her, a little push. Quiet was likewise whispered to and pushed, except that in her case the push ended with a pull. The two children then slowly went and seated themselves on the high recitation bench that Rye had said belonged in front of the room under the blackboard. They each had a different kind of old torn primer, and both books unlike Louisa's. It happened, however, that all began with a pictured cat followed by a dissertation on that animal. Motivation of study, correlation of past experiences, pupil concepts, and other such expressions gleaned from a course in education whisked through Louisa's brain, but none of them seemed to have any connection with the smug-faced cats and the two badly frightened children staring at her from the recitation bench. She remembered in time that the children doubtless knew that the pictured animal was a cat. Pete confirmed her supposition when she asked him what the picture was. "And the word under it is cat too," Quiet volunteered in a scarcely audible voice. On the basis of such knowledge, the lesson progressed rapidly. It was Pete's digression into letters, however, that brought Louisa's first class to an end. Anxious to show that he knew more than Quiet, Pete pointed to the word he had learned and said, "The thing in the middle of the cat is a A." Louisa heard Lander titter, but did not look around. Quiet, unmindful of the other children watching her and not to be outdone by Pete, pointed to the word in her book. "I know what's on the end." "Which end?" Pete asked, and Lander giggled again. The back end. It's a B. No, it's a T," she said triumphantly. Her triumph was short-lived. She looked up, saw Lander laughing and the girls smiling, then burst into frightened tears. Louisa, remembering Rye's advice, hastily dismissed class and sent its members outside to study the words and letters they had learned. The other classes in reading passed off uneventful. They had the same battered books they had used the year before and knew just where to begin. All the children read with a toneless drawling of each syllable, but spelled loudly and with gusto. Morning recess came, and the children went down to play in the grassy space before the church door. Louisa went too, because she did not wish to stay alone in the house. It wasn't that she was afraid, but a vast feeling of loneliness crippled her. Something more than loneliness, a kind of nostalgia for her own childhood. It seemed such a little time since she herself was a child with teachers. Now she was a teacher with children and must behave accordingly. She wanted to lie in the grass and watch the shining tops of the poplar trees weave in and out against the blue sky, but fearing such conduct would seem undignified, she sat on a fallen pine trunk and watched the children build a playhouse with moss and sticks and stones. The study of arithmetic occupied the period between morning recess and dinner time. Much to her surprise and wonder, Louisa found that she liked to teach these children arithmetic. The blackboard and chalk came into their own, and for a time the small house resounded with a sharp click of chalk on wood. Even Quiet forgot to be afraid and did not cry once while trying to count her toes and racing with Pete to get a row of figure ones across the blackboard. Lander was glibly reciting the multiplication tables of the sixes when the decorum of school was broken by a long snore and grunt which seemed to come from under the floor. Too startled to recognize the sound, Louisa looked to Rye for an explanation. The child, after first raising her hand, said, "It's the hogs sleeping, ma'am." "Whose hogs?" "I just don't rightly know. It might be part of Iron and part of Hayes's. They all run together. Pop's have got 2 splits, and Hayes's 1, and Iron's a crap," Lander interrupted. "The 1 split is the Steagall's." "And they all sleep under the schoolhouse," Louisa said, more to herself than the children. "Only when it's rail hot or rail cold," Rye consoled. "They don't make so much noise, only just the fleas." "Fleas?" "Yes'm. The fleas jump off the hogs and come up right through the floorboards and run us pert nigh crazy by spells." Louisa bade Lander continue with the sixes, and so dismissed hogs and fleas from the conversation. But more than once during the afternoon and succeeding days, the hogs and their fleas upset the routine of school. Their grunts and snores soon ceased to trouble her. It was when they rubbed their long backs against the foundation posts until the small house shook that she would call a short intermission for the purpose of driving the hogs away. She grew accustomed to the sober question, "Can I go to the woods and flea myself, ma'am?" and at times would find it necessary to go herself. Dinner time came. Rye and Pete went home. The other children disappeared behind the jack pines about the house, and Louisa was left alone to wrestle with the contents of her red lard pail. She ate a raw tomato, the biscuit and egg sandwich, then pushed the remainder of the bucket full of food aside. Corey, she decided, after this her 3rd meal on the woman's fare, had only 1, maybe 2 requisites for the food she prepared. There must be plenty of it, it must be clean, the rest, it appeared, didn't matter. She ate a peach Lander gave her, wished for a cigarette, studied this course of study for a time, then tired of being within doors and thinking that so few children might well mind themselves while they played, she decided to walk about the school grounds a bit. She thought first to go rambling among the pines on the ridge side above the schoolhouse and walked up the hill a short distance, but even on this bright day, something about their straight black trunks and high sighing tops so close against the blue sky saddened her and filled her with a kind of heavy apprehension, worse than a fear of some one thing because it was wordless and indefinite, but real as the black pine shadows across her feet. She returned and stood in the school door and watched the sunlight quiver above the white limestone rocks in the big road. After the heavy twilight of the pine trees, the road looked cheerful and inviting. She could see but little of it, for it twisted as the valley turned and was almost immediately hidden behind a clump of beech and poplar trees. She wanted to walk up it and see the upper end of the valley, maybe houses where children lived that might come to school. Rye and the other children were busy with their play down by the church house, so she did not invite them to go with her, but walked alone around the grove of trees and came to a neglected field by the roadside where blackberries grew in the tumbled-down rail fence corners. She picked and ate some, and thinking their sweetness would please the children, lined her hat with the leaves and put berries in it. The high noonday sun filled her with a pleasant languor so that she went no farther, but returned to the grove of beech trees and sat on a gray beech root shielded by the great tree and watched thunderheads pile into the sky. It was pleasant sitting there with no need to move for 15 minutes. Her watch said 20 minutes of 1 by Cave Creek time, and since the watch was the only measure of that time, it could never be wrong. She had been sitting for less than 5 minutes when she heard Rye called, "Teacher, teacher," in a soft undertone with a kind of worried inquiry in her voice. Thinking the child missed her and only wanted to know where she was, she answered gaily enough, "I'm here, just behind the beech trees." "Teacher, you better come back," the girl called. She wondered at the unmistakable note of command in the child's voice. It held no disrespect, only a command that the child intended to be obeyed. Louisa did not call to her again, but got up, and taking the blackberries, walked around the grove of trees and saw the 5 children of her school watching her as they stood together a few feet in front of the schoolhouse door. No one of them moved or came toward her, but stood stiff and silent, watching her while she walked up to them. She was aware of their stiffness and their silence, and thinking that they disapproved of her going away for even such a little distance, was half angered, and at the same time wished to justify her action. "It is so cool in the little grove by the road. Why don't you play there?" she asked as she walked closer. She saw Lander nudge Rye, but without smiling, as a child so often does at some such action. Rye came toward her a step or so and stopped and touched a flat limestone rock in the road with her bare great toe. "School playground ends right on this, teacher," she said, and her voice carried the same respectful command as when she had called a moment before. I didn't know," Louisa answered, and stood staring at the flat rock and the child's bare brown foot poised above it, shapely as the flying foot of Mercury, only this foot was still and somehow rigid as the stone. She didn't know what she had done, but knew that it was something. She remembered the blackberries. "I brought you some berries," she said. "I picked them down by the fence. They are so nice and big." She held the hat low for them to see. "Maybe they will forget whatever it is that I have done and be children again," she thought. They looked at the berries. Their silence and the rigidity of their bodies told her that she had done wrong to go down the road, but worse still to pick berries for them to eat. "Wouldn't you like some?" she asked, and knew they wouldn't, but she had to say something. They said nothing. Little Quiet, who was the youngest, reached for one and had her fingers stained with its dark juice before Rye came to life and slapped the berry from her small hand and said all in one breath, "You wouldn't be eating their berries." Mabel looked at Louisa. "Don't feel bad, teacher," she said. We our folks won't let us eat blackberries. They give us—" "The fever," Rye said, and seemed kinder than when she had slapped the little girl's hand. "I'm sorry," Louisa said. Corey had blackberry jam on the table this morning at breakfast. The children lied. But so had the man Jess, and the superintendent's silence had been a lie. She knew now that the trouble that had happened was not finished, but went on from day to day. Whatever it was, she could not think about it. She would not make their trouble her trouble. So many things in this chapter to think about. We're kind of left again with a cliffhanger. Not really a cliffhanger, but still with that mystery. What in the world? What's the trouble going on? Louisa has now realized that it's not in the past, whatever it is. Whatever's happening is still happening. And obviously with the children lying about the blackberries, it's going to be part of her daily, what she's got to take care of every day at school. But as she says, she's going to make sure she doesn't become part of the trouble. So she's trying to remove herself from that. You can see it. So many things in this chapter. Some of the ones that jumped out at me that I really liked in the very beginning, when she talks about the perpetual twilight and the fog laying in the valleys and the mountains sticking out above the fog. That's one of the prettiest things about mornings in Appalachia, in the area where I live. You'll see that so many times. The fog kind of hugs close down to the valleys, but you can look up on the mountaintops and they're already, maybe the sun's shining, or at least beginning to shine. Maybe the sun's just beginning to peek over them. So that's just one of the most beautiful things. And the perpetual twilight reminds me of, if any of you are familiar with an area not too far from where I live, the Nantahala Gorge. So the word Nantahala is an Indian word, and it means place of the noonday sun. So like she was talking about the Lee Buck cow's home, she realized after that she never needed to worry about seeing the sunrise because she would already be at school by the time the sun shone in there. The same, it would be gone by 3 o'clock in the day. So that kind of tells you that perpetual twilight. Living here on the north side of the mountain where I live, there's parts of my yard that don't get sunlight until way up in the day. So I can really identify with that part. I really like that. I love Rye. Rye's my favorite character probably in this book because of her outlook and because of her knowledge being so young. But man, has she not stumbled upon the the solution for so many of our problems when we're upset, when we're being emotional. The answer for crying is to go outside. Doesn't being outside just help you? Whatever's troubling you, whatever's making me feel bad, if I can take a walk in the woods, if I can just go out and sit in the backyard, take a walk down the road, I immediately feel better. Things feel better no matter what they are. So I really enjoyed that part. And I like the part jumped out to me when the teachers, Louisa is really depressed by what she finds there, you know. Gosh, how can I be a teacher? They have nothing. But the children, through their eyes, they see this is going to be the best year ever because we have all these things, which really what they have is a broom and a bucket and erasers and chalk, you know. They really don't have that many. But gratitude. I'm a big believer in gratitude, and I try to be grateful for things, and so I really enjoyed that part. The gratitude you can see in their voices and or hear in their voices, and the way the book describes their expressions on their face, how excited they were, how grateful they were, and just with those very small few necessities, they thought that meant they were going to have the best school year ever. They were just so grateful, you could tell. So now that I've shared the things that jumped out at me from this chapter, the things that I liked the best about it, I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know what you liked. What are the things that caught your attention? And as always, I hope you'll continue to drop back by and help me find out what happens to Louisa and follow along as we continue to read Mountain Path.